You didn't notice when it started. The messages got shorter, the tone felt distant. They were still there, but something had shifted. INFJ don't just disappear overnight. They fade, quietly, slowly, painfully. They pull back, piece by piece, hoping someone will notice the space growing between you. But most people don't, because INFJ never make a scene. They stop reaching out not to punish you, but because they feel unseen, unheard, unimportant. And for someone who loves so deeply, that kind of emotional invisibility is devastating. This isn't a story about ghosting. It's about grieving in silence, about someone who gave everything emotionally until they realized they were the only one holding the connection together. So they let go, not with anger, but with quiet acceptance. If you've ever been left wondering why an INFJ walked away, this video will show you what you missed long before they said goodbye. INFJ don't suddenly slam the door. They don't cut you off without warning. When they stop reaching out, it happens in quiet waves. At first, it's just a missed message or a delayed reply. Then the check-ins become less frequent. The long, thoughtful texts you used to get are now replaced by brief responses. Conversations that once felt deep and effortless start to feel like small talk, or worse, like effort. And maybe you don't even notice it right away. Because INFJ won't announce that they're fading. They'll keep showing up for a while, even when they're hurting. They'll give you one more chance, and then another, until they're emotionally drained. Because the truth is, they never wanted to stop reaching out. They just got tired of feeling like they were the only one trying. This isn't about punishing you. INFJ aren't passive-aggressive or manipulative. They withdraw because connection matters deeply to them, too deeply, to keep forcing when it's no longer mutual. Each layer of detachment is a silent response to being overlooked. They feel every shift in energy, every moment of disinterest, every time their presence feels like a burden instead of a gift. And instead of asking to be loved louder, they start loving you more quietly, until eventually that love has nowhere else to go but back inside. It's not coldness, it's weariness. Emotional burnout from caring too much for too long with too little in return. So when an INFJ stops reaching out, it means they've already cried, journaled, reflected, and processed the grief you never saw. They didn't walk away lightly. They faded out because staying present started to hurt more than disappearing ever could. By the time an INFJ physically walks away from a relationship, they've already left emotionally. You felt it, the way their responses softened, the way their presence dimmed. They didn't lash out. They didn't make a scene. They just started pulling back in subtle, heartbreaking ways. You might have noticed they were quieter, more distant, not as warm. But what you didn't see was the grief happening behind the silence. Because INFJs don't leave easily. They leave when it no longer feels emotionally safe to stay. They felt the cracks long before you did, the ignored feelings, the one-sided conversations, the constant need to prove their worth. They started pulling back, not because they stopped caring, but because caring started to hurt. INFJ value emotional depth more than anything. So when that depth is dismissed or taken for granted, it wounds them deeply. And instead of fighting for scraps of connection, they begin mourning the version of the relationship they once believed in, quietly, privately, completely. You see, INFJ don't want to walk away. They stay longer than they should. They rationalize, they forgive silently, they give second, third, and 10th chances. But when they realize their emotional safety is compromised, when it becomes clear that their efforts aren't being seen or reciprocated, they begin the slow, internal process of letting go. They prepare themselves, layer by layer, for the detachment. So when they finally walk out the door, don't be surprised if they seem calm. That calm isn't indifference. It's the result of 1,000 silent goodbyes they already said in their heart. This is the part most people don't understand. By the time an INFJ physically leaves, they're no longer fighting for the connection. They've already cried the tears. They've already gone over every memory, every moment that didn't feel right, and they've come to a quiet, painful conclusion. It's time to stop trying, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. At some point, the INFJ stops trying to be seen because nothing they do seems to matter. They used to share their thoughts, their feelings, the things that kept them up at night. They used to open up slowly, carefully, hoping the person they trusted would hold that vulnerability with care. But over time, they started noticing the silence in response, the distractions, the way their emotions were acknowledged but not understood. And that's when it begins the slow shutting down. INFJs don't slam emotional doors. They close them quietly, piece by piece. It doesn't come from anger, it comes from disappointment. From realizing that they're speaking but not being heard, that they're present but not being felt. Being invisible in a room full of people is one kind of pain, but being invisible to someone you love, that's what breaks them. And so they stop trying. They stop reaching for a connection that now feels hollow. They don't stop caring. That's the part that hurts most. They still feel deeply. They still notice the small things, but they keep it inside now. They've learned that expressing themselves doesn't lead to closeness. It leads to being misunderstood or worse, dismissed. So they become quieter, more distant, not because they've stopped loving, but because the space no longer feels safe to be fully themselves. This shift is hard to detect at first. It looks like, I'm just tired, or I've been busy. But if you pay close attention, you'll realize the spark in their voice is missing. The way they used to light up when talking to you, it's gone. They're still there physically, but emotionally, they've taken a step back. Because nothing feels worse to an INFJ than opening up and realizing the other person wasn't really listening. That's why they stop trying to be seen, not to punish, but to protect. Because after enough disappointment, even the most emotionally generous soul learns to turn inward. And when an INFJ goes quiet, it's not the silence you should fear. It's what had to happen to create it. INFJ don't walk away the moment something feels off. They lean in. They overextend themselves emotionally, mentally, even spiritually, trying to fix what feels broken. When they sense distance in a relationship, they don't blame. They try to understand. They look inward first, asking what they might have done wrong. They send the long texts. They ask the hard questions. They check in, even when it hurts. Because for them, love isn't passive. It's deeply active. They believe if they care enough, try hard enough, love deeply enough, maybe things will realign. But slowly something shifts. They start realizing they're the only one reaching, the only one adjusting, the only one willing to sit in the emotional discomfort and try to mend the bond. And that realization doesn't just sting, it shatters. Because it's not just about the connection failing, it's about the effort being one-sided. They gave more than they had, thinking maybe this time it would work. They stayed hopeful even when their own needs were going unmet. And hope for an INFJ is a double-edged sword. It's what makes them hold on longer than they should. It's what convinces them that maybe silence is just stress or disinterest is just distraction. So they give a little more and a little more until eventually there's nothing left to give and still the gap remains. By the time they begin to emotionally detach, it's not because they've stopped caring, it's because they're exhausted. They've poured themselves into a connection that didn't pour back. And no matter how empathetic they are, INFJ aren't invincible. Even they reach a point where their emotional tank runs dry. That's the part no one sees, the invisible burnout. The moment they realize their effort wasn't matched, not because the other person couldn't, but because they wouldn't. And that's when the detachment begins. Quietly, sadly, unavoidably, not because they wanted to let go, but because holding on was slowly destroying them. INFJ never leave easily. When they care about someone, they hold on longer than they should. Not because they're naive, but because their love runs deep. Detaching isn't some cold, calculated decision. It's a slow, emotional collapse that happens when all their quiet efforts have gone unnoticed for too long. They think deeply, feel deeply, and love with their whole soul. So when they start walking away, it's not out of spite, it's out of heartbreak. Most people won't see it that way. From the outside, it might look like they gave up or disappeared without warning. But what really happened? They stayed for weeks, maybe months, hoping something would change. They gave subtle signs, the kind only someone truly paying attention would notice. The sadness behind the smile, the shorter replies, the emotional distance creeping in. They weren't being passive aggressive. They were slowly grieving, mourning the connection before it was even over. They didn't want to leave. That's the part that cuts the deepest. They wanted it to work. They wanted to be seen, understood, chosen without having to beg for it. But INFJ know that staying in a relationship where they constantly feel invisible, where they're always pouring but never being poured into, hurts more than walking away. And so when they reach their breaking point, the decision is it's devastating. They don't leave with a speech. They don't explode. They withdraw quietly, gently, but permanently. And afterward, they don't go around explaining themselves or trying to make others understand. Because if someone didn't see the pain while they were present, they won't see it now that they're gone. That's what makes it all so heavy. INFJ leave not because they stopped caring, but because staying was slowly erasing who they were. And that's a kind of pain that lingers. Long after the goodbye, long after the messages stop, they carry that hurt silently because the goodbye they gave wasn't to the person, it was to the hope that person would ever truly see them. INFJ never expected perfection. They weren't asking for someone who always said the right thing or knew exactly how to handle their emotions. What they needed, what they hoped for, was emotional reciprocity, presence, effort, a willingness to meet them halfway in the emotional depth they live in every day. They didn't need someone flawless. They needed someone aware, a partner who saw their heart and chose to care, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. I think that's where it fell apart. It wasn't the arguments, it wasn't the distance, it was the emotional neglect when the INFJ kept showing up, feeling everything, pouring from their heart and getting silence in return. It's not about grand gestures, it's about emotional attentiveness, responding when they open up, noticing when they shrink, offering safety, not solutions. And when that didn't happen, when their emotional world started to feel like a monologue instead of a dialogue, they began to pull away, not to punish, but to protect. INFJ gives so much internally. They notice everything. They feel when the energy changes even slightly. And for a while, they'll make excuses. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe it's not the right time. But slowly, those excuses turn into quiet realizations that their needs are going unmet, not because they're too much, but because the other person simply isn't present. And that absence starts to chip away at the connection, not because of drama, but because of disconnection. The INFJ starts to feel like they're loving alone, trying alone, caring alone. And nothing makes an INFJ detach faster than feeling emotionally invisible in a space where they used to feel safe. It was never about being perfect. It was about being emotionally honest, vulnerable, willing when that vanished, when the emotional mirror cracked. They didn't just lose the relationship, they lost the hope that the connection could be repaired. And that's when they start to leave, not physically, not loudly, but emotionally, piece by piece. When an INFJ finally detaches, it's not an impulsive decision. It's a quiet conclusion formed over time. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to walk away. They endured. They analyzed, doubted, forgave, hoped, until their heart couldn't carry it anymore. And by the time they stop reaching out, the grief has already happened. The mourning is already done. What's left isn't anger, it's clarity, a deep soul level knowing that they gave everything they could. And now it's time to let go. They don't detach to punish. That's not who they are. INFJ aren't wired for emotional games or silent treatment, but when the emotional safety is gone, when they feel more pain than peace, they slowly close the door from the inside. No announcement, no confrontation, just silence. A final kind of silence that says, I loved you deeply, but I also love myself enough to stop hurting. And once they reach that place, once they let go with peace instead of bitterness, there's no going back. Not because they hate you, not because they don't care, but because returning would mean betraying the very boundaries they had to fight to build. INFJ know what it costs them to stay in spaces that don't nourish their emotional world. So when they leave, it's with finality, not cold, but clean. You might not even notice when they start pulling away. It happens gradually. Fewer texts, less emotional depth, shorter conversations, until one day there's just absence. And it won't come with blame or explanation because INFJ often assume you wouldn't understand anyway. So they let go quietly, with grace, with dignity, and with a kind of love that still hopes you grow, even if it's without them. And that's the hardest truth. If an INFJ stops reaching out, it's not a moment to win them back. It's a sign you've already lost the parts of them they tried to share for so long. Once detached, they don't look back. Because looking back means reopening wounds they worked so hard to heal. If this felt like your story, if you've ever loved deeply, stayed too long, or walked away quietly just to protect your peace, then you're not alone. This space is for people like you who feel everything, but are rarely seen for it. So, if you found comfort here, stay. Subscribe. Come back when the world feels too loud. You don't have to explain yourself here. We already understand.